In this episode, I'll be chiming in on curses and baneful magic.
First, let's talk about what I mean when I say curse. When I say curse, I mean an intentional ritual or spell crafted for the purpose of causing ascertainable harm to another. This is pricking a puppet's heart with a needle, intending it to cause chest pain in somebody else. This is writing down someone's name in blood, along with the names of many generations of relatives in that person's lineage, and tossing it into a black fire. That's, for those who don't know the reference, a fire set by using sulfur or brimstone, fire and brimstone. Get it? Anyway, it's taking ritualistic or metaphysical actions intended to cause harm to another. Do I believe curses are real? I generally shy away from answering that question directly because I don't understand what relevance it is to you, what my personal and private beliefs are. I'm not here to necessarily convince you or convince anyone that curses are real or even not real. If you need the question, are curses real, answered for you, then I'm probably not the person to go to anyway. That's a question you really need to answer for yourself. That being said, I do think that this concept of the curse is something a lot of people don't really understand, mostly because we can't verify it through scientific methods or in any tangible evidentiary way that's going to be convincing to us. So by and large, in modern day society, most people think curses are bullshit, just a load of superstitious hogwash. Okay, but what I find interesting is that no one really doubts the insidious power of psychological emotional manipulation, of doing little more than planting seeds of doubt, for example, in someone's mind and watching horrific tragedy unfold as a result of those little passive seeds that we grow. Psychological manipulation, I think, is just a very small, microcosmic, and specific example, is a contained snapshot of the concept, a much bigger concept, and something even more insidious. The art of psychological manipulation is just the visible tip of a horrible iceberg of what human ingenuity and craftiness is capable of. In the same way, you can kind of be an asshole and place a banana peel, for example, in the pathway of somebody who's walking and watch that person slip and fall and break a hip bone. You can do the same thing energetically and place energetic impediments in somebody's pathway that can cause severe harm. So this concept is something that has a metaphysical counterpart to the physical capabilities. I always find it funny when people debate whether it's okay to curse someone. Look, it's never okay to curse someone. My belief, it's never okay to punch somebody in the face. It's never okay to kick somebody or inflict physical violence. So why would I think it's okay to inflict psycho-spiritual or even emotional violence? That being said, I think there are specific circumstances, of course, that would justify the use of violence to ensure that a greater good prevails, or justify the use of violence to prevent further harm. There's also justification, where violence of some kind is used to exact justice. Do you sometimes need to exert some form of violence to prevent further harm and further violence from happening? I would say hell to the fuck yeah. Ultimately, the question of where you stand on cursing and baneful craft comes down to virtue ethics. Our world isn't this polarized dichotomy of figurative angels and demons, right and wrong, pure good and pure evil. There is a little bit of yin in the yang and a little bit of yang in the yin, and that is how you strike a chord or harmony. There's really no way around it. Harm has to come for a greater good to prevail. Destruction is necessary for there to be creation. The question, which is what virtue ethics is all about, is how you weigh the consequences of harm against the constructive, positive attributes of what you seek to do. You can't create anything extraordinary in this world. You can't bring life into this world without baneful acts. Something must always die for something to live. But what dies will be reborn, and what lives will die. I'm not encouraging or discouraging baneful craft. Instead, I'm presenting a way for you to look at baneful magic and then judge for yourself. Let's all assume, for the sake of argument, that cursing is real, curses are real, and you possess the power to inflict a curse as an act of punishment. I'm going to do something a little bit controversial among practitioners, and that's lump cursing and binding all together. Yeah, I know the difference, but for the sake of this thought experiment, they're all under the same category. Here's why. Binding, as it would be perceived by the person being bound, is a form of harm. You are inflicting harm on that person by not letting that person do what that person wants to do. I know we can run circles debating this all day and play games of semantics. You're not really harming them, you're preventing them from action except in the eyes of the law. False imprisonment is still a crime. And why is that? There is a philosophical and moral reason behind it. When you forcibly prevent me from doing what I want to do, no matter what it is, then from my perception, you're harming me. Intent to harm is baneful magic. In fact, just ask anybody who has ever been confined or pinned down against their free will how non-harmful that was. I just don't think binding is any less worse than a curse. We just say that as practitioners to make ourselves feel better. Okay, so if you possess the power to inflict baneful magic onto someone to prevent that person from harming another, or as a form of justice because no other means was able to give an injured victim justice, would you do it? If I see a perpetrator coming at an innocent victim with a knife or gun in hand, and I have the power to stop that harm, but in doing so I might physically injure that perpetrator, would I do that? Or better yet, should I do that? Most people with a conscience would say yes. Yes, it would be noble and honorable to take affirmative action in that kind of a situation and intervene and stop that perpetrator from hurting the innocent victim, even if it means you inflict some kind of violence on that perpetrator. In every human narrative, heroes intervene. Heroes don't let shit happen. Heroes prevent shit from happening, and that means battling the villain, or more realistically, battling the perpetrator of shit. Yeah, it's funny, right? When we are entertained by the story of the hero, we never see the hero's defeat of the villain as inflicting an act of violence, and yet, more times than not, that's exactly what it is. The hero almost always has to do something objectively, clinically violent, but in our minds it's not horrible and it's justified. What we try to shield ourselves from thinking about is that a baneful act must take place by the hero to stop the villain. In law, of course, there's the justification of self-defense, but self-defense as a claim requires reasonable force, and you can't use unreasonable force. So we are going to add that consideration in here to magic as well. The baneful magic you inflict as a force you put out into the world has to be reasonable in the face of the injury presented. Okay, so physically you might use something we normally consider bad, violence, to prevent even more serious violence from happening. In other words, you might resort to something negative, which is violence, for the sake of a greater good. Say I were to cast a curse on someone. I would never say that that act is okay. Cursing is never okay. Don't flippantly try to convince yourself or anyone else that it's okay. But sometimes in very specific circumstances, it's justified. If you try to say that cursing is okay, then you're really just deluding yourself or trying to delude others that what you're doing isn't as bad as it actually is. If I were to hex a person, I'm going to acknowledge, okay, what I'm doing is a shitty act, but that person had it coming. I would have a great justification for what I'm doing. It might not be okay, but it's justified. In Eastern traditions, you're not supposed to learn martial arts by itself without also learning meditation and initiating into a particular religious faith to connect to deity and to exercise compassion and wisdom. To learn martial arts without also developing some form of wisdom and faith is a pretty easy way to get led astray. I see occult craft as similar, where you do really need to have a personal moral code of conduct. The more you come to realize just what you're capable of doing, the more tempting it is to exert that power to show everybody how awesome you are, to show everybody that you shouldn't be messed with, yada yada. And then you really have to learn how to let go of ego and pride. There's so much wisdom in forbearance, in holding back. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you can doesn't mean everybody in the world needs to know you can. You know how there's those 4 tenets in Western mystery traditions: to do, to dare, to know, and to keep silent? I believe part of to keep silent is also to keep silent about your personal powers, to not feel the need to brag or gloat about what you're capable of doing. It's about not having to show off how much you can do, how daring and brave you are, or how much you know. So you do, you dare, you know, and then you keep silent about it. So back to curses. A curse is never my first resort. It is always my last resort. I've said that so many times. I will do and I try everything under the sun before I go for the curse, including therapy, meditation, driving out into the wilderness and screaming at the trees, saging, legal measures, of course, mediation, talking it out with a friend, a ranty blog post in which I vent out my anger, yoga, a bottle of wine. I mean it. I try everything first. A curse is always the absolute last resort. And then when you do it, when you pull that trigger, you shoot to kill. Just like it is in gun training. If you're going to pull the trigger, you shoot to kill. Metaphor, guys, that was a metaphor. I'm speaking figuratively, not literally. It's a metaphor, figure of speech. What I mean is, when you do feel it's at that desperate point of needing to lay down a curse, then you lay that shit down. You don't half-ass baneful craft. If you're at that point of no return, then I say go for the jugular. Figure of speech, metaphor, 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 figure of speech. I am against cursing and baneful magic. I am. But what has always, I don't want to say irritated, but what's the word? I guess what's always concerned me about those who are so self-righteous about white light, white magic, and whatnot is its utter lack of empathy. Let me explain. You meet somebody who has just survived abuse, an egregious personal violation, something just absolutely was traumatizing and awful, just an absolute travesty of justice. That person is grieving, is angry, is disoriented, is numb, is confused, is hurt, is hateful, is miserable. Is that really the time for you to say to that person, open your heart chakra and let the white light in. Try Vipassana meditation. That always helps me find my inner peace. You can get through this. You just need to be positive and trust the universe. Live and let live. You have to learn to forgive. You have to let it go. You have to let it go. Here's what I would do. Put post-it notes and stickies all over your house that say how wonderful life is, and write sticky notes to remind you to forgive and to find your inner peace. Do it. I double dare you to say that to somebody who's suffering. There is no such thing as wrong or right, good or evil, but there is such a thing as severe consequences. Baneful craft comes with severe consequences. That's one reason to avoid it, but sometimes empathy is about taking on those consequences because of love. It's about taking a bullet for someone. It's about pulling the trigger to stop the perpetrator on behalf of another so that the other, that loved one, can remain innocent and can live out life freely. It's getting your hands dirty so someone you love doesn't have to. When people say as some kind of an absolute maxim, never, never curse, I always feel like that position lacks empathy. I think it's the right position in a sense, and I agree with that statement as a maxim. Ideally, you should never, never curse. But I think there's this thing called real life, and not everybody lives in this perfect fairy tale world where you can meditate away your problems and cleanse your crown chakra and your heart chakra with beautiful white light. That's just not reality. Like, if you're Buddha, then sure, but most of us, we're just not Buddha. Oh, hi, Buddha. Now, the next question. Do I believe there are karmic repercussions to cursing? Yes, but whether or not those repercussions are magnified back threefold or whatever, that I'm a little less inclined to buy into. There will absolutely be consequences, a repercussion to the force you've exerted and put out into the world, good or bad, whether you're trying to heal someone with the exertion of force or harming someone through the exertion of force, a curse. It doesn't matter. A force is a force. What you put out, something, a reaction force, is going to push back. This is probably going to make me sound like an asshole, but I think Being afraid of karmic repercussions in the event of having laid down a curse or a hex is juvenile. You did that shit, now own it. In modern society, we don't and probably should not talk about cursing as being real in a tangible scientific or evidentiary sense. And it's not beneficial, I don't think, to really even talk about curses as something that's supernatural. I think it's better to frame cursing and harmful craft within the constructs of psychology. Curses, I think, can be explained, at least in part, by psychology, and curses and hexes and even binding are all just the execution of some sort of mental calculus. So I think the funny thing about cursing is you can either use that mental calculus to try to inflict harm on the person who you believe has wronged you, or you can use that mental calculus to empower yourself so you can find peace with the situation. When it comes to myself, I didn't say I do, I try to find peace with the situation, but I don't impose that standard on others. Part of empathy sometimes is to not be so love and light or zen, but it's to subject yourself to the same vibrational frequency as your loved ones, and from there do what needs to be done. And sometimes that's a low vibration. Empathy is not standing in the light and looking down on someone, saying to somebody who's suffering, who's wallowing in a lot of darkness, hey, you over there, come here, come over to where I am, come to where it's light and bright, come feel the love. Like, that's just not empathy. Empathy is leaving the light and going into darkness to be with the person who's wallowing in darkness. Empathy as an occult practitioner means when someone I'm connected to is in a very dark place, I need to take myself to that same dark place. I need to go there myself and be present in every way with that person in that dark space. And then together, hand in hand, walk that person out. Baneful craft, sometimes when executed with wisdom, is the truest form of empathy.
Bell Chimes In is a video chat series that seeks to start discourse to be interactive. So I hope this isn't just about my perspective. I want you to share your perspective with me, whether that's through a video on your channel, a blog post, or just in the comments section below. However you choose, come on, let's talk.